Reclaiming my time.
All right.
In July, the Crime Subcommittee held a hearing to examine gaps in our federal corruption laws that limit their effectiveness and allow corruption to persist. If elected officials decide to profit from the trust they hold with their constituents, then the foundation of our democracy is weakened. We as lawmakers must ensure that prosecutors and investigators have the tools they need to fully and effectively address the issue of public corruption. I, along with my colleague from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, introduced H.R. 2572, the Clean Up Government Act of 2011, to strengthen our public corruption laws by restoring some of the prosecutorial tools that have been eroded by the courts. One such erosion was the Supreme Court's decision in Skilling versus U.S. In Skilling, the court held that federal honest service fraud statute does not apply to prosecutions involving undisclosed self-dealing by a public official, but instead only to cases that involve traditional bribery or kickback schemes. Many instances of public corruption do not involve a quid pro quo bribery or extortion scenario, but rather public officials who exploit their positions and influence to obtain benefit from an undisclosed financial interest in the matter. The bill addresses the Skilling decision by clarifying in the criminal code that a scheme or artifice to defraud includes a scheme or artifice by a public official to engage in undisclosed self-dealing. The bill also clarifies the law with regards to public officials who receive gratuities simply because of their official position. The bill amends the definition of official act to include conduct that falls within the range of official duties of a public official, not limiting official acts to just decisions or actions on a matter pending before the public official. The bill also enhances other existing federal statutes used to fight and deter public corruption, all aimed at ensuring that public corruption and related offenses are effectively addressed. At our hearing in July, the Justice Department properly summed up the need for this legislation. Our citizens are entitled to know that their public servants are making their official decisions based on the best interest of citizens who elect them and pay their salaries, and not based on bribes, extortion, or a public official's own hidden financial interests. When FBI Director Robert Mueller testified before the committee in March this year, he testified that the FBI recognizes that fighting public corruption is vital to preserving our democracy, protecting our borders, securing our communities. Indeed, public corruption remains our top criminal priority. People can differ on how much government is too much government or how the government should impact their daily lives, but every citizen expects and deserves an honest government. Some argue that votes at the ballot box or an oath of office are sufficient to hold a public official accountable to their constituents. Sadly, we have too many examples of public corruption to know these methods are not sufficient. Corrupt officials do not broadcast their illegal acts or make them known to their constituents. Even the most informed voters are often unaware of ongoing corruption by public officials. Robust investigations and prosecutions are a necessary function to ensure honest government. H.R. 2572 enjoys support from diverse groups, including the FBI Agents Association, the National Taxpayers Union, the Campaign Legal Center, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, and others. And I've received a number of letters in support that I would ask unanimous consent to be included in the record.
Without objection.
There's bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate for reforming our public corruption laws, and I would hope that this bipartisan bill would be one of the things that can be utilized to tell the American public that we in Congress are doing our jobs, and I urge its support.
Chairman, thank you for yielding. I want to thank Mr. Sensenbrenner for his diligence on this issue and his excellent work on this legislation. It is true I am from Illinois and sadly no stranger to corruption. While the U.S. prosecutor has done an excellent job ferreting out corruption and prosecuting it successfully, one could make the argument that hunting for corruption in Illinois is similar to hunting for a cow. It comes up to you and moves. Toward that end, 4 of our last 8 governors have gone or will go to prison on corruption charges. 2 of the predecessors who sat in my seat have served or about to serve time for corruption. Our last governor is facing 15 to 20 years in prison for what prosecutors have called serious criminal acts that have done enormous damage to public confidence in Illinois government. So for me, this bill is personal. And for me, the tools in this bill that will enable us to prosecute corrupt officials are not simply words on a page, but vital mechanisms for justice. In fact, one of the key provisions of this bill that will empower prosecutors to go after public officials for using their offices for personal gain was used to prosecute former Governor George Ryan. It also used to prosecute Mr. Blagojevich until the Supreme Court wiped it out in Skilling versus U.S. Before Skilling, the Honest Services Fraud Statute addressed two forms of fraud by public officials, bribes and kickbacks, and undisclosed conflicts of interest resulting in personal financial gain. But the Skilling decision effectively struck down as constitutionally vague the undisclosed self-dealing language, leaving the Department of Justice unable to pursue cases where public officials conceal conflicts of interest that result in personal gain. Let me give you one brief example. Under current law, if an elected official were to vote for a deal that benefited a private company and that private company gave him a suitcase of cash in return, that action could be prosecuted. However, if an elected official voted for a deal that benefited a company in which he had an undisclosed financial stake, that action would be untouchable. Our bill directly addresses the court's concern about vagueness by using precise and definitive language that clearly defines who is allowed to do what. I know there has been some concern about to whom this bill applies and whether it should entrap unwitting officials, so I want to be clear. This provision only applies to elected officials who knowingly conceal, cover up, or fail to disclose material information with a specific intent to defraud. The language is carefully crafted to ensure no public officials are prosecuted for unknowingly violating a rule. The bill includes a number of other vital tools to fight public corruption, such as a provision to prevent public officials from receiving gifts because of their positions, and a provision that makes clear that government officials who accept private compensation for using the powers their jobs afford them may be subject to prosecution. Public corruption has real, tangible costs, both in terms of dollars and in terms of depriving the citizens who elected us of high-quality, efficient services. But in the final analysis, the real cost of public corruption is the loss of the public's trust. At these difficult times, it is hard to lead without the public's trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two amendments. We'll do Nadler number 6 first. I don't know how we got to number 6 since I only have two amendments, but Nadler number 6.
Okay. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the Sensenbrenner Amendment to H.R. 2572, offered by Mr. Nadler of New York. Page 4, line 2, strike includes and insert means.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from New York is recognized to explain.
Will the gentleman from New York yield?
Oh.
I will be happy to yield.
I incorporate by reference my words of glowing support to the Scott amendment for this amendment as well.
Then, Mr. Chairman, reclaiming my time, I incorporate by reference Mr. Scott's comment, and I yield back.
All in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Opinion share, the ayes have it. The amendment to the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? The gentleman from New York is recognized for the purpose of offering an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk marked Nadler number 7.
And the clerk will report Nadler number 7.
Amendment to the Sensenbrenner Amendment to H.R. 2572, offered by Mr. Nadler.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from New York is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman, will the gentleman yield?
I will be happy to yield.
Same old song of support, and I thank the gentleman for yielding.
And I thank the gentleman for supporting the amendment, and I urge everyone to adopt it, and I yield back.
I don't know that we've ever witnessed this kind of bipartisan exchange before
Mr. Chairman,
the Judiciary Committee.
I was just curious who was going to start leading us in Kumbayah.
That could be next. All in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Majority haven't voted in favor of the amendment. The amendment is agreed to.
And
I just wondered whether we wanted to renumber Section 666. Some people might.
we'll call it 777, or maybe 999. In any
999 has seen its day. I think.
Hopefully. In any event.
The question is on the manager's amendment. Those in favor say aye.
Chairman,
Opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and
what was
the
that?
amendment is agreed to. A roll call vote.
What amendment was that?
No, that was on the manager's amendment, right?
Oh.
Okay. Reporting quorum being present, the question is on reporting the bill as amended favorably to the House. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is
Chairman,
amended.
may we have a roll call?
Reported favorably. A roll call vote has been requested. Clerk will report.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner votes aye. Mr. Coble? Mr. Gallagly? Mr. Goodlatte? Mr. Lundgren? Mr. Lundgren votes aye. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Issa? Mr. Pence? Mr. Forbes? Mr. King? Mr. King votes aye. Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes aye. Mr. Poe? Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Griffin? Mr. Marino? Mr. Marino votes aye. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes yes. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes aye. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. Quayle? Mr. Quayle votes aye. Mr. Amade? Mr. Amade votes aye. Mr. Conyers?
Aye.
Mr. Conyers votes aye. Mr. Berman? Mr. Nadler? Aye. Mr. Nadler votes aye. Mr. Scott?
Aye.
Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Watt? Aye. Mr. Watt votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Waters? Ms. Waters votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Pierluisi? Mr. Pierluisi votes aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley votes aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez votes aye.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Gallagly.
Mr. Gallagly votes aye.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe.
Mr. Poe votes aye.
Gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Griffin.
Mr. Griffin votes aye.
Gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye.
Gentleman from North Carolina.
Mr. Coble votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 30 members voted aye, 0 members voted nay.
The ayes have it, and the bill as amended is ordered reported favorably. Without objection, the bill would be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating amendments adopted. Staff is authorized to make technical conforming changes. Members have 2 days to submit their views. Congratulations to Mr. Sensenbrenner and to Mr. Quigley.